I couldn't. I love the night. That's the only time I feel really alive.
That's what David wanted.
Blood, I was to find, was a necessity as well.
A vampire in love with a slayer. It's rather poetic. I am the monster the breathing men would kill. I am Dracula.
Good evening, my fellow vampire lovers. The sun is going down, and you know what that means. It's time for me to record another episode of my podcast, The Beautiful Dead. As always, I'm Lena Nazari. Go to lenanazari.com or go to my Instagram, The Beautiful Dead Podcast. It is the best way to get in touch with me or to see what I am up to. In May, I will be at Fan Expo Philly, which I cannot wait for. I'll be there with my panel, and I will not have the 5th book out, but hopefully by July, when I am in New Orleans for GalaxyCon, I will have the 5th book out, so fingers crossed. I'm going to try and record ahead on these so that I can get this book finished. I may just have to go lock myself in a cabin for a couple days and just knock it out because, you know, life happens, and then books have to go on the back burner for a minute. All right, I talked about doing this last week. It's happening. We're doing it. Any horror fan knows the name Dario Argento, so it is time to see what his idea of Dracula is. Here's the DVD right here. Very exciting. I think there might actually be commentary on here, and I would be interested in sort of hearing what his thoughts were and why he made some of the decisions he did, just because I think Dario Argento's mind works differently than most of us. Any of you who have seen, you know, Suspiria, Mother of Tears, you know what I'm talking about. And this is, if you look it up, it's called Dracula 3D. So I think it is, there are definitely some things that you're watching and you're like, yeah, that was probably cool in 3D, but it doesn't really translate when you don't have the glasses on. But I was excited to sit down and watch this. I thought to myself, Lena, you must have seen this at some point. But I just couldn't remember. And about 5 minutes into the movie, I was like, oh yes, I remember this one. And I will tell you, once I realized which version this was, what popped in my head when we get to it. And I was like, oh, I remember this one. All right, if you have never listened to me talk about movies or watched my YouTube channel, massive spoiler alert, I start at the beginning, go all the way to the end, talk about everything. So you're gonna know who hooks up, who gets pregnant, who dies, blah, blah, blah. So consider yourself warned. Oh, let's shut that off so we don't hear any more alerts. I am so sorry. And normally I would edit that stuff out, but the whole point of this whole channel is so that you can see kind of behind the scenes mistakes and dogs and kids and all that good stuff. So yes, I just remembered to turn off my alerts, so we shouldn't hear that anymore. Let's do it. Let's talk about Dario Argento's Dracula 3D. We have some crossovers. We have some really cool crossovers, actually. So Thomas, and I'm so sorry if I get this name wrong, Thomas Kretschmann is Dracula in this. And in the 2013 series Dracula with Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, he plays Van Helsing, which is pretty cool. And he's also Damaskinos in Blade 2, so a few crossovers. Even more crossovers, Mr. Rutger Hauer, who plays Van Helsing in this, played Dracula in Dracula 2 Ascension and Dracula 3 Legacy. So it's interesting. Hauer plays Van Helsing in this and has played Dracula before. Thomas plays Dracula in this and has played Van Helsing before. And, you know, Mr. Rutger Hauer also played Neil in True Blood. He was Lothos in the Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie. And he was Barlow in the 2004 Salem's Lot. So he's played some big vampire things. pretty awesome, actually. I was pretty excited to see him as Van Helsing because I do like Rutger Hauer, and I couldn't remember his performance very well, so I was excited to now watch it from with a different lens, which is really breaking down the vampire, world in this, specifically the Dracula world. So let's talk about it. We open with an older woman who is bidding goodnight to a younger woman, and she leaves, and the younger woman kind of waits a beat and then sneaks out of the house and heads down a dark street. And I was like, uh-oh. There is a taxidermist who is working on gutting an animal in this little cabin in the woods, and he looks out the window and he sees this young woman moving through the woods alone. She enters a barn and she meets up with a young man, and they kiss. The old village girl, stable boy trope. Like, it's like every romance book cover. I mean, except mine. 5 minutes in and people are naked. I was like, yep, that's Argento. It starts to storm as they make love, and someone is moving around outside. So we see a shadow move across, and I'm just like, And she looks up and he's like, oh, it's just the wind. And I was like, wow, there's just cliches everywhere. And we are like, just a couple minutes in, I was here for it. When they're done, she's like, please walk me home. I don't want to be alone. And he's like, nah, because I'm married and we can't be seen together. And she gets really upset. What a gentleman. And he's like, well, you have the cross that I gave you. You don't need me. And so she gets pissed off and she rips it off and throws it at him. And then he lets her walk alone through the dark woods all by herself with no cross on. And I'm like, wow, chivalry. So he takes the cross, he hangs it up in like a tree, because what is he going to do? Take it home and give it to his wife? And he leaves. At this point in time, she starts to run because an owl is swooping down and chasing her. She runs towards the taxidermist cabin screaming for help, and he pulls a rifle as she falls. The owl transforms into a vampire and she is bitten, and the taxidermist just watches and smiles. Dracula, we're in. It's like just a couple minutes in and I was like, oh, we're in. This was the moment where I've seen this. Now we cut to daylight. A train arrives and a young man gets off. He pays for a horse, but the local warns him that the woods are very dangerous. But why do we listen to locals, right? So he continues on, he's riding through the woods, and he's suddenly chased by a pack of wolves, who then suddenly just kind of disappear. So he's asking himself, did I just see wolves? Because that's weird, because it's the daytime, and also now I can't see them. Night falls, he arrives into a village, and he boards his horse and gets some food and drink, and we find out it's the 4th of May, and that he's a journaler. He's a man who journals. We love a man who journals. Gives us some very good, character exposition. That night we see men digging up a grave. It's the stable boy who we saw previously and 2 more men. They crack open the coffin and it's the girl that we just saw die. And we find out her name is Tanya and she has a vampire bite on her neck. Not a good sign. They are going to stake her, but then the man, the taxidermist, comes out of nowhere and starts to attack them before they can stake Tanya. And he screams, why didn't you stay with her? And then jams the side of a shovel into the stable boy's head. There's no way I'm going to be able to show this on YouTube, but I was like, whoa! The other 2 men overpower him, beat him into unconsciousness, turn and realize the girl is no longer in her coffin. Uh-oh. Then we see a wrist being sliced by a thumbnail and blood being poured into a glass, which the new vampire girl now drinks. So I just want to be clear because here's our first vampire pause. So we know she's been bitten and we know that she is now a vampire because she's risen from the grave. She's been buried and risen from the grave. What I don't know is, did she need to drink Dracula's blood after being drained to turn, or is she now just drinking Dracula's blood because, she's thirsty and he's like, I'll give you this to tide you over until we can get you your first victim. I don't get to see the embrace, so I can't tell you for sure, but I'm thinking he feeds from her, then she feeds from him, dies, is buried and then rises, is what I think is happening, but who knows. All right, moving on. Now we see a beautiful woman who's teaching piano to a little girl. And anybody who's watched Argento's movies knows that this is Asia, his daughter, because she's in a bunch of his movies. I just don't know yet at this point which character she's playing, but that is Asia. We know her. She finishes the piano lesson, walks out, and that's when we see our traveler come running up, and he's like, Lucy. And I was like, okay, there's our Lucy. And she's like, Jonathan. And I was like, oh, there's our Jonathan. She says, where's Mina? And Jonathan says she will be here on Friday. We learn that Lucy wrote to Mina explaining that the Count needs a new librarian, and Jonathan is here to take that role. So he's a librarian in this one, not a real estate agent. The town is called, I think they're saying Passburg, but you know, who knows. And Lucy states that the Count has done so much for the town, and he's such a gentleman, and they have new schools and everything because of him. And then we find out Lucy is the mayor's daughter. Once Jonathan leaves, the mayor is like, why didn't you tell me that you wrote Jonathan and he's now working for the Count? And she's like, oh, I forgot. But we can see that the mayor is like, why did you do that? Now we see a group crying over the dead, cheating stable boy who had the shovel to his brain. And then we see a noose being hung in the town square. And I was like, ooh, I forgot they used to do that. Like, just hang people in the town square. The man who killed the stable boy, which I'm just going to go ahead now and start calling him Renfield, because he's the Renfield character. Renfield is at the window and it's barred, and he's watching them like set up this noose, and Jonathan is walking by and like backs up, and Renfield grabs Jonathan and is like trying to strangle Jonathan. So all of the people in, like the cops or whatnot, they like grab him, pull him away from Jonathan, and then they shackle him to the prison wall and they ball gag him. I was like, wow, wow, it's escalated fast. Now we cut to Jonathan on horseback. He's back in the woods again, and this time he's headed to Castle Dracula to take his new job. When he enters, he finds a letter on the table when he first walks in, and he heads up to the room to unpack. That night, he enters the dining room and he sees there's a fire in the fireplace, a full table of food and wine. Tanya enters and then smells his hair, which I'm like, have I ever smelled someone's hair? Have I ever just like leaned in and smelled? I don't think so, but I see it in movies all the time. Now, is she smelling his hair or smelling his blood? It's probably more that he smells good because she's hungry, but it's so weird when people smell hair. That's all I gotta say. Dracula enters and he gets her under control and sends her away and says, that's my niece. Who hasn't heard that lie? That's my niece. Jonathan asks if Dracula will eat, and he says,
I never eat in the evening.
And I was like, oh, are we gonna get it? We don't get it. He doesn't say,
I never drink. Why?
boo. But we do get this line.
Listen to them. The children of the night. What music they make.
And I was like, okay, well, at least we got that one. It's not the wine line, but we do get the children of the night line, which I love it. I'm always, anytime I watch Dracula, I'm always on the lookout for those key lines, you know. After eating, Dracula takes Jonathan to the library, and he explains that he's been collecting for such a long time. He needs all of his books cataloged because he has no idea what he has, what he doesn't have. And Jonathan, clearly a book guy, you know, us book nerds, we get excited by this stuff. He is like so ready. And as they're talking, he turns and he looks in one of the bookcases and realizes that he's casting a reflection in the glass, but Dracula is not. So, vampire pause. We know that vampires have to be buried and then rise out of their grave. We know that They do not cast reflections. We know that they drink blood. We assume that crosses will repel them because that was the whole point of her ripping off the cross, and now she's not safe. So we've learned some good stuff about the vampires, and as far as we can see, classic vampire. And we know from the bite that it's 2 long canines. We also know they're retractable because when Dracula first comes and starts talking to Jonathan, he doesn't have fangs. So we've learned some stuff already, boys and girls. Later that night, while journaling, Tanya comes into his room and she's looking at Mina's picture, and then she makes the moves on him, and he's like, looks like he might give in, and then he like throws himself back. They end up knocking the frame to the ground and breaking the glass. You know, I love this trope. The human cuts themselves and the vampire reacts. So he cuts himself when he's picking up the frame, and Tanya puts the cut to her mouth, and Jonathan's like kind of into it for a moment, and then he kicks her out. And then he notices that the picture is gone. He runs outside of the room, even though we're talking about just seconds between her leaving and him running out, but nowhere can he see her at all. So either she's fast, she can dissipate, or she can fly. But whatever it is, she's gone. The next day, he starts to catalog the books, and there's one book that he starts reading that's all about a Romanian nobleman in 1462. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm about to play the clip, but if you're just listening to me, you know it's the whole Dracula story. Later that night, he goes to the fireplace to warm himself, and he sees the charred remains of Mina's picture. He confronts Tanya about throwing the picture into the fire, but before they can really like get into a heated argument, she just strips naked, and he forgets what he's going to say. Tanya starts to feed, but Dracula enters and throws her aside. And he says, "He is mine," and then bites Jonathan. John wakes up in his bed and he does not feel so good, and he notices now that his reflection is kind of blurry and that the sun hurts his eyes. So we know that the turn is starting. We still don't know exactly what it takes to turn. I don't know if it's the whole 3 bites over 3 nights, or I don't know, because we don't get to see the whole thing. But what we do know is that he is starting to turn a little bit. Dracula visits the prisoner, which, like I said, I can now tell you that he's our Renfield. And I know this because Dracula releases him from the chains just by looking at him. And the prisoner calls him master, and that's where I was like, okay, this is our Renfield. Jonathan is locked up in his room, and he finally breaks out. He sees Dracula climbing the outside of the castle and makes it outside, but is not in really good shape. And then he gets attacked by a wolf that turns into Dracula and bites him again. So now we got a second bite. So vampire pause. So we know that they can scale walls. We know Dracula can. That doesn't mean that all of them can't. Same thing with turning into wolves. We only know that Dracula can transform. We never see any of the other vampires transform. Dracula can transform, and he can transform. Now we've seen an owl and we've seen a wolf. I'm just telling you, there's a lot of things he can turn into, and one of them is the thing that I vividly remembered when I realized what version this was, and we will get to it. Okay, the next day, Mina arrives on the train just as Dracula awakes in his coffin. So this implies to me that there's some kind of connection between the two of them, and her arriving sort of snaps him awake. Lucy meets up with Mina and explains that Jonathan is at the castle and she will see him tomorrow. They have some girl talk, and Lucy explains that she has 3 suitors, but she's not really in love with any of them. When they get into town, we see that Tanya's mom is telling the local lieutenant, "I don't believe that my daughter was killed by a wolf." And he's basically telling her, like, "Lady, shut up. She was killed by a wolf. That's it. Just stop. You're being hysterical. You're being crazy." That night, Tanya rises from her coffin, so now we see that they do sleep in coffins. And when she wakes up, she sees Renfield outside her coffin. He cuts himself to feed her, and who does not love breakfast in bed? And we see that Renfield is just smitten with Tanya, and she really does not give a crap about him at all because she wants Jonathan. Meanwhile, Tanya's mom is trying to sneak out of town, but she's being followed. And before she can get onto her horse, she gets an axe to the back. And the guy who did it is like, you were headed to the city to tell the authorities and ruin everything. And then he kills her. So this was the first moment where I was like, oh, wait a second. Is everybody in on this? We see that Lucy can't sleep. She stands and she opens a window, and then just like that, Dracula's behind her. So, vampire pause. I don't know if that's necessarily him being invited in, but we do know he can either dissipate and then, you know, reform somewhere else, or he's that fast that you don't hear him or see him come in, or he flew, but obviously can pretty much be wherever he wants, whenever he wants to. The point of this pause was to say, I don't know if opening the window was specifically inviting him in, or she just knew he was out there, because they start to kiss heavily, and it's heavily implied they're about to have sex, and then it fades to black. The next morning, she has a scarf around her throat. She's very pale. And Mina says, you have a fever. We should call the doctor. And Lucy says, I'm going to rest, but you should go to the castle. And Mina's like, no. I'm going to stay here and take care of you. I'll send a note to Jonathan explaining, and I'll ask him to come here. She finds the axe man from the previous night, and we learn that his name is Zoran. So I will now be calling him Zoran. But Zoran is the big dude who axed Tanya's mom in the back. We find out that he makes deliveries to Dracula's castle, and she's like, can you please take this letter for me? And he agrees. The mayor confronts Lucy about her illness and rips her scarf off. And he's like, I have to see, but there's no bite there. So clearly the mayor knows that there are vampires, knows Dracula's a vampire, and he's worried that she's showing every sign that Dracula has been there, but there's no bite on her throat, so he calms down. That night, Dracula is looking out his window and Mina is looking out her door. So there's like a moment. It's like they're both thinking about each other, or I'm not sure what's going on. The mayor says, we really need to close the door. It's nighttime. And he says, the reason that Jonathan didn't come see you is because the Count is very, very tough on his employees. I'm sure we'll figure it out. So she goes to sleep and she's dreaming that she's running through the woods and she sees a wolf eating what appears to be a woman under a white sheet. And then she awakes to hear a wolf howling, and we see a shadow pass by the window. She lights a candle and we see muddy footprints on her bedroom floor. So vampire pause. So this implies to me that Dracula knows she's there, he's come to visit her, and that he has put these images into her mind while she's sleeping. The next day, Mina is helping to bathe Lucy, and we see 2 small puncture wounds on the back of her knee, which I was like, okay, because there is like a pretty major vessel back there that you could definitely feed from, but nobody would see it. So I was like, all right, Dracula, I see you. That's a good place. She sits down in the water because she's like, oh, it's insect bites. And then she sits down in the water. She tells Mina, I feel so much better. You need to go to the castle and see Jonathan. And so Mina agrees. She rides on horseback, side saddle, like a lady, into the woods when she's attacked by wolves. The horse throws her off, and the wolves are getting closer when another wolf runs up and scares the rest away. And she faints because she's a lady, and we faint all the time. When she awakes, she's on a couch in the castle, and she starts to explore, and she sees the library, and she sees her husband's writing in the catalog. So I think that's the moment where she was like, oh my God, I'm at Dracula's place. Jonathan's here somewhere. Dracula approaches her, and he explains, I found you unconscious in the woods. I carried you here. Meanwhile, Renfield tells Tanya that he saw Mina, and she is beautiful. And Tanya says, well, I want to see her, and shoves past Renfield. Dracula is pouring wine for Mina, and he says that he sent John to the city for some books and he won't be back for a few days. And then he tells her how beautiful she is. And she says she feels like she's already met him before and she seems drawn to him. Tanya is watching the exchange and is crying. So I'm like, okay, does she want Jonathan? Does she want Dracula? Or does she want both? I think she wants both. Renfield says to Lucy or Tanya, just forget them. I don't think that's going to happen. Mina says, I need to go, but Dracula says, please stay, and he leans in for a kiss. And she says no, but you can tell that she wants to, but she says no, and she runs out into the night and onto her horse. She makes her way back to town, but now it's daytime. So I'm like, did you ride through the night? Or maybe it was like close to dawn when she took off, and that's why he didn't chase after her. Anywho, she makes it back to town. It's daytime, and the priest says, I'm so sorry. It's Lucy. Ooh. The mayor's crying over his daughter who is dead, and he said, she couldn't breathe. I called the doctor, but it was too late. Mina explains that she can't remember anything that happened at the castle, and when she does... Mina explains that she can't remember anything that happened at the castle. Then she goes to the church to talk to the priest, I guess because she feels unsettled and, she wants to talk to somebody. She tells him about her dreams of a wolf ripping apart a girl and asks to talk to Tanya's mother, but the priest says, oh, she left the village. And Mina says, you need to tell me what's happening. Like, clearly she knows something is up. The priest says, I will call for the one man who can help you, but promise me you won't do anything until he gets here. Then Lucy's funeral happens. After the funeral, there's a secret meeting of the town officials, and they say, it's the Count. We have to do something about what's going on in the town. And Zoran is like, well, you were fine with it when he was paying off your debts and built a new school. And as they start to plot, the room starts to fill with flies. The window opens and the swarm of flies turns into Dracula. Which was pretty cool. I'm not a huge fan of Dracula turning into bugs, but it was a really cool scene. I did think it worked. So Dracula shows up, and all the men, except for Zoran, who was never gonna betray Dracula, look very scared. He sits down and he says,
Who among you wishes to break our pact?
They all stay silent, and he says, you're all cowards. At this point in time, his nails grow very sharp. So we know that he can use his nails as weapons and that he can adjust their length at will. So they become like claws. He starts to kill the men one by one, and he leaves only Zoran, since Zoran was the only one who was defending Dracula and was not going to betray him. We see that he has mind control when he gets the lieutenant to turn the gun on himself. That's when we really get to see the mind control. Meanwhile, the mayor is drinking his feelings and he is passed out when Van Helsing arrives, and he introduces himself to Mina.
I am Abraham Van Helsing. You must be Mrs. Harker.
She explains Lucy's death and Jonathan's disappearance to Van Helsing, and she directs him to lodging when he asks where Lucy is buried. Oh, when she was buried. And she says, today. And he says, be more careful with the door. It was open and anyone could have wandered in, and then he leaves. So Van Helsing is shown to his room in the inn, and he starts to unpack. We see Mina is sleeping, but the window is open, and the wind in her room wakes her up. So she goes to the window and she sees that Van Helsing is walking through town. We see him arrive at Lucy's crypt, which is empty. So we know they rise really quickly then. Mina follows him in. And that's when we see Lucy walk in with a little girl in her arms. She sees Mina and she says, don't be afraid, it's me, Lucy. Van Helsing approaches with a cross and Lucy's fangs descend. She kicks the cross out of his hand. They tussle and he cracks a lantern across her face, which quickly lights her on fire. So vampire pause. The vampires in this universe are extremely flammable. Like, she goes up fast. Lucy burns to death, and we see the little girl that she has bitten is the little girl from the piano lesson. She's been drained, and Van Helsing tells Mina, you need to leave, you don't want to see this. And then he stakes the girl. So we know that if you bite them and drain them, they turn But again, I never see if there's blood exchange happening. So I don't know. Later, by a fire, he tells Mina all about vampires. He says he learned about vampires when he was the director of an insane asylum in Carfax. So here's our tie to the novel. In a flashback, we see Dracula was attacking one of the patients. Oh, I'm sorry. We do get to find out. Van Helsing does explain it. So, you know, Lena was like an hour into the movie at this point being like, I guess they're just not going to explain to us. But Van Helsing does explain that the vampires in this world are made through an embrace. So you drink from them, they drink from you, you die, you rise. Classic, exactly the way I like it. Meanwhile, at the castle, Dracula is pissed that Van Helsing has killed Lucy. He is very mad. Van Helsing explains that Dracula can mesmerize people and wipe memories, and that's why she can't remember what happened at the castle. He says, I know what I have to do. Please don't leave the house. She begs him to bring Jonathan back, and he says,
I will bring him back to you if he's still human.
It's good. Don't ever promise you're going to bring somebody back unless you know for sure that they haven't been killed already. Dracula asks Tanya to help him with something, and she shows up in Van Helsing's room. And at first I thought that she was going to like try the whole seduction thing, but it escalated very quickly. She attacks him. He stabs her with a cross. She tries to pull it out, but she starts to turn into ash. So now Van Helsing knows that Dracula knows that he's in town. So no more surprise. Mina is in her bedroom and the mayor is keeping watch outside her room. But again, he's stinking drunk and he passes out. This is the scene that popped in my head as soon as I realized which version of Dracula I was watching. A giant praying mantis climbs the stairs. That is right. A giant praying mantis. Obviously, I'm going to show this on YouTube. The praying mantis comes up the stairs and then stabs the mayor with his like pincher just as Mina opens the door and faints. And I know I made a joke about like the women in movies fainting too much, but I think this is a faint-worthy offense. When you see a praying mantis climb up the stairs and stab your best friend's dad. Now, the way that it's shot is she faints and Dracula walks up and catches her and scoops her up and carries her away. So he can transition very fast. So he's pretty good at shifting, I guess. And also we get the Dracula carrying Mina trope, which you know I love. I love seeing a man carry a woman. I just love that. Van Helsing goes to find Mina, but it's too late, so he goes to the church to find the priest who pretends he doesn't know Van Helsing. He doesn't want to get involved because he's a big coward. Van Helsing gets to work melting down silver and making silver bullets, and then he smashes down some garlic and makes like a garlic slurry. So I knew at this point in time, like, oh, he's going to dip the bullets in garlic. So that tells us about the garlic in this world. Zoran tries to stop him, but Van Helsing kills him. Van Helsing? Rutger Hauer, man. He does not play around. Dracula walks into his castle with Mina in his arms and tells Renfield Tanya is dead. And Renfield just starts wailing. He was so in love with Tanya. Dracula lays Mina into bed and then says,
The anniversary of the death of my wife, Lena de Graz. A sudden illness tore her away from me when she was only 20.
If you're trying to seduce a woman, perhaps don't start the date off with talking about your dead wife and then asking her to wear your dead wife's dress. Just saying. This is not a dating podcast, but I was just like, wow, that came across very heavy. In the woods, the priest finds Van Helsing and says, okay, I want to help. So I guess he had like a moment of confidence and courage and felt like he should do the right thing and stop Dracula. So he decides to come help. Now we see Mina. She's wearing a new dress, which I think is the dead wife's dress, and her hair is now wavy. And Dracula tells Mina what he is, and she's like, I don't fear you, and then calls him my love.
Stop it.
I am nothing but an out-of-tune chord in the divine symphony.
And I was like, what is happening right now? It's a full moon, has nothing to do with vampires, but it's cool for a setting. And Dracula and Mina have taken it outside. And she bares her neck, but he's like, no, it's not the right time yet. Meanwhile, Van Helsing and the priest are at the castle, and they enter through this like dungeon. They go through a basement door, and they're like in a dungeon, and they find the coffin room. They find the coffin room and 2 empty coffins, so they open the third, and I'm gonna be honest, at this point in time, I had completely forgotten about Jonathan. Because he makes like no impression in this movie at all. And I was like, oh, that's right, Jonathan. So Jonathan is in the third coffin. He looks very confused when they pull the lid over, and I was like, oh, is he a victim? Have they locked him down there for like a quick meal? Because he looks like confused and scared, and he doesn't look so good. Well, then his fangs descend, so they stake him and he turns to ash, and I was like, oh. But again, Jonathan made like no impression in this movie at all. Renfield comes out, he kills the priest. Poor priest. He like finally had a man moment, and then he gets killed. But he got killed doing the right thing, which was trying to fight the vampires. Van Helsing then takes care of Renfield, and he looks out a window and sees Dracula leading Mina into the woods. And I was like, what are they doing? They started in the bedroom. Whoops, I knocked over my DVD here. They start in the bedroom. Then all of a sudden they're like up on the top floor on the roof overlooking a balcony, and now they're in the woods. I'm like, dude, Dracula, just like make your move already. So they're in the woods, and he's taking her to visit his wife's grave, and I was like, what is happening? Like, the Riz is not rizzing with this Dracula. We find out that she died in 1476, and her statue looks just like Mina, of course. And she says, I am not her. And this is when she starts to realize, like she starts to put it all together. She's realizing that Dracula killed Lucy and Jonathan. And she's like fighting her desire for him, but then she gives in to him and kisses him. He pulls her hair aside and bites her neck, and it sounds like she's into it. So at this point in time, I was just like, what is happening? He pulls her hair aside, bites her neck. She's into it, and then Van Helsing interrupts.
Kill him, my love.
The heart, Abraham! You have to strike me in the heart!
Dracula and Helsing fight, of course. Van Helsing's gun is thrown to the side, and Mina is starting to kind of come out of the trance. So this is when I'm recognizing, oh, he was mind controlling her. So he was telling her, my wife died, and now you're going to be my new wife, and you've been brought back to me because you're my wife reincarnated, and this is where she lays, and she loved to be outside. And Mina seemed like she was kind of into it, but it's because she was mind controlled. So she starts to come out of her trance, and she picks up the gun and tells Dracula to stop. He approaches her, and she shoots him. The bullet starts to like disintegrate his skin, and I'll show it on YouTube, but like it penetrates his heart, and that's not necessarily what kills him. It's the garlic that starts to spread. So it starts to like disintegrate his skin, and you can see the rib cage emerging. And then he falls to the ground and he turns to ash. So she explains to Van Helsing that she couldn't control herself. He was forcing her to say that she loved him and wanted to be with him, even though he knew that it wasn't true. As they walk away, Dracula's ashes rise up like and spin like in a tornado, and then a wolf form shoots from it. Which I know was like, just from the movie's point of view, was supposed to be like a cool 3D effect. But it leaves you wondering, did Dracula die or didn't he? And that's the end. That's the way that it ends. That was Argento's Dracula. So if you guys have ever like turned on a movie a couple minutes in and you knew it was Dracula, but you weren't totally sure which one, and then you remember a giant praying mantis, it was Argento's Dracula. That's the one you were watching. So let's talk about it. Tropes I love and tropes I hate. I love reincarnated love, especially when it's Dracula's reincarnated love. I know it's overdone. I know it's been done before. Now, this movie came out in 2012, I want to say. Like, it's not an old movie. It came out way after Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I for sure know that it inspired a lot of these choices. But I love a reincarnated love, especially when Dracula finds his dead bride. I don't think he handled it so well in this one. Like, he really wanted her to be his dead wife, like a copy. But I do love the idea. I love the town conspiracy to work with or for the vampire trope. I love that, when the town's like working together to feed the vampires, and that's how they remain safe. The idea that the town has a pact with the local vampire, I love that trope. And of course, the cutting the glass and the cutting the finger and the vampire reacts, so overused, but I do love it. I can't really think of a trope in this one per se that I hated. I was not a fan of him shifting into bugs. I will tell you that. Owl, that's cool. Wolf, love that. Love when they shift into wolves. Even bat is fine. But shifting into like a praying mantis and roaches, I was just like, I don't like that. All right, how scary or evil are the vampires of Argento's Dracula? So here's the thing, Dracula can mind control you. He has the whole town in his back pocket. We watch him slaughter a room full of men without breaking a sweat. He can shift into a number of animals, but they are bound by the sun. A stake to the heart will take out the others, but the ending makes me wonder if Dracula is dead. So maybe he is unstoppable except for the sun. It takes a special man to come to the town to take out Dracula, so that is something that you have to think about. I mean, he's Dracula, and I would not want to be the one that was up against him trying to stop him. Plus, Lucy kills a kid. And Dracula has no problem mind controlling a woman into saying that she loves him, which, ooh. So, 8 out of 10 stakes to the heart for scariness and evil. You gotta give it to him, okay? He was a tough Dracula to go up against. Now, how sexy or alluring were the vampires? So Dracula, Tanya, and Lucy clearly like sex. They have no problem using seduction to lure their victims in or get what they want. There is several nudity and several seduction scenes, so the movie is very sexually driven. Jonathan seems to me like he's fighting his desire for Tanya, but she is super hot and gets naked. So I don't know that it's because she's a vampire or just because it's a naked chick standing in front of him. Dracula has proven that he will mind control you into saying yes, which kind of feels like a psychic roofie, so I'm not totally down for that. So yes, they're sexual, but consent really doesn't seem to matter to them. So 6 out of 10 onks for sexiness and allure. They are scarier than they are sexy, but they're sexy. Let's not lie, okay? All right, my thoughts. Anytime I watch a Dracula, I'm always nervous because I'm like, will I enjoy this? Or will it physically hurt my soul? I have no idea. This one is a creative version. I mean, I definitely see some inspirations from different Draculas. Bram Stoker's Dracula, Frank Langella's Dracula. Like I see some things that were definitely from other Draculas. That being said, you know, it was a creative take. The librarian thing was different. The shifting into bugs, not a super fan of that, but he was such a badass. So when he realized that the town officials were plotting against him, like, he was such a badass. And that part was cool. I think that Thomas's interpretation of Dracula was very solid. I think Rutger Hauer's interpretation of Van Helsing also very solid. Their standoff, I thought, was really, really good, and it really does kind of boil down. So to me, Dracula boils down to the standoff between him and Helsing, and the interaction between him and Mina and Lucy, I think, is what the Draculas really boil down to, and it was solid in this one. Lucy and Mina were not the most likable versions that I've ever watched, but they didn't necessarily ruin it for me. There's just Lucy's and Mina's that I love much more than these two. I love the idea of Jonathan being a librarian and not a real estate agent. He's like there cataloging this vast personal library. It felt almost a little bit like Beauty and the Beast with the library. But the only thing is, like, why would Dracula have a book giving away all of his secrets and then leave it out for the new librarian to read? That's the one thing where I was like, well, that's convenient. Maybe he wanted him to find out. Maybe that was the easiest way to get down to it, which was like, oh, you're here as dinner. And honestly, I just brought you here because I want your wife. But I was like, he has this big ancient book about himself, not Vlad Tepes, the warrior, but like, it starts talking about Vlad Tepes, and then it's like, and the rumor is that he's a vampire, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, why would you leave that out? That's like leaving out your little book that has your passwords to like your bank account and stuff. I'm like, well, why would you leave that out? Oh, I don't know. I'm getting way too upset about this. I enjoyed the different town characters. I mean, they're all sort of over the top, but they have their purposes and their personalities, and I thought that was kind of fun. It's not the sexiest or coolest Dracula I've ever watched. He does not knock off any of my top 7 Draculas off the list, but it wasn't the worst I've seen at all. I've seen so many that are so much worse. So it's like middle of the road Dracula. I recommend it if you're a Dracula fan. If you love Argento and you've seen a whole bunch of his stuff, but you haven't seen his interpretation of Dracula, I highly recommend it. It's worth a watch. It is available on Tubi for free. So I would pick A Stormy Night, pizza, red wine, you know, whatever your combo is, popcorn, I don't care. But get your favorite snacks together on a stormy night. Find the person you love or a fellow horror fan at your side and just enjoy it. Just enjoy it for what it is, which is Dario Argento's interpretation of a famous vampire. Next week, we are talking about Village of the Vampire. It's another one of those DVDs that have been sitting collecting dust, and I really need to watch it and get it over with because I don't have good feelings about this one. So it's on Tubi if you really want to watch it before me, or if you just want to come and hear me talk about whether or not it's worth it, I don't blame you. Join me next week just to see how bad it is, or if I'm pleasantly surprised, which rarely happens. Come join me as I talk about Village of the Vampire. In the meantime, the time changes happened, so now our nights are shorter, our days are longer, which is a bummer for someone like me that can't be in the sun. But I do hope everybody's having a lovely time enjoying the end of winter. I do love you all, and I wish you wicked hugs and bloody kisses. Good evening.
And big finish. Thank you.